Hello again, it's LockNoob, and we haven't done a tutorial for ages, so I thought it'd be a good time to do one on these locks. And what are these locks? Well, if you read the title, you probably already know. These are disc detainers. Disc detainer locks. They work differently to pin tumblers in that they have discs and, well, not pins, it's all in the name. And you get different types. So we have things like these four here, which are Chinese disc detainers, very common. You get them all over the place. You get Chinese disc detainers which are slightly higher precision. Then you get ones found in cars, and this is the Ford TIB system, which is very common and popular in Europe. And then you get higher security ones. Notable by its absence are things like the Anker-Lass system and the new ABUS granite system, but I do have in its place, to show what high security disc detainer is, the Abloy, and this is the Abloy Profile, I think, not the classic, the next one up from that, not the Protec. So, what is a disc detainer? How's it going to work? Quite honestly, if you don't want to know anything about disc detainer locks, I'd go watch something else. If you do want to know about disc detainer locks, how they work and how you might go about picking them, then you probably want to continue watching it. So, where do we start with how these work and what are they? Well, first of all, let's have a look at the keys and the keyways. You'll notice that the three most common style keyways that you get for these, or three of the most common, should I say, are like this. And you can already tell that they're slightly different keyways. They're more open than a standard pin tumbler. These Chinese disc detainers are all very much the same, and they all have this lozenge shape sort of hole for the key within the round keyway. They all have round keyways. If you look at the keys, they actually are probably more similar, actually. So let's have a look at a standard Chinese disc detainer key. And they are relatively lozenge shape in end profile. They've got cutaways here. Then we have a slightly higher precision one. And higher precision because the discs in them are thinner in profile, so you get more discs for the length, so higher precision ones. And this one has a groove because there's small amounts of warding in the keyway. Here's the actual key it goes into. It's shaped like a grenade. How novel. Then we have things like the Ford TIB system, which again, you can see really it's not a million miles away from the standard, most basic Chinese disc detainers. It's a round, lozenge shaped key with cuts in it at different angles. I'll go into why there are different angles in a minute. And then you go all the way up to the Abloys, and very similar to the classic. But again, you can sort of see similarities, can't you? That it's a key which goes in. It's got an odd shaped profile. It's almost like a half circle. But nevertheless, it's similar. It has different angle cuts that interact with an individual disc. So, discs. What does this do? How does it work? Where do we start? Okay, well, let's push some of this just to the back a minute and give ourselves a little bit of space so we can talk about discs, why they're called disc detainers, why the key's this shape, and why they're that shape on all the other locks too, for that matter. So, here is a sort of cutaway disc detainer. I say that because the cutaway's at the wrong side, in my opinion. You can't see the working until it actually unlocks. But the key goes in. It's got, again, angles of cut. So, yeah, you can see that you have everything from sort of one cut, which is basically flat, all the way to four cut, which is at an angle. So it goes in and it turns. And you'll see a couple of things. There are no pins. The actuator here turns, allows the shackle to be released. But you do see discs. So the discs are the things with these little nodules on. Okay, these little sticky up points. So I'm going to call them nodules or stops. Let's call them stops. Stop sounds better than nodule, doesn't it? Stops. So these little stops and the discs are spaced by spacers. And that allows the discs to move freely without rubbing against each other. Okay. And you see that those stops have indeed stopped at different positions. That's because the discs have rotated to a set position. The stops, which interact with the core here, 1, 2, and 3, are the ones which in essence are turning the lock. These locks are either tensioned at the top or the bottom. The Ford Tib keys, they tension at the top. However, most Chinese disc detainers, most of them, they tension at the top. So you'll always find that the first disc or discs are always a one cut flat, and they push against the core of the lock. So all these can be in other positions, but this one can be tensioned against to provide tension to the actual core itself. Okay, so that's all well and good. You know that the discs rotate. They rotate to a position based on the angle of cut, but it's hard to really think about that unless you actually see the discs themselves. So let's have a look at some discs. I've ripped them out of another lock, and you'll see that they're nothing special, at least in these basic Chinese disc detainers. And I can line these two up, and these two are the same bitting. You'll see that you've got the stop here, you've got a cutaway for a sidebar. I'll explain what that does in a minute. Essentially, it's the locking mechanism, and you've got a place for the key to go in. Now, not all of these discs are in essence bitted the same. If I look at this one, for example, you'll see that whilst I can align the stops and the keyway, the angle of the cutaway is further down. The cutaway here now no longer lines up. I'd need to rotate that one slightly more this way to align the cuts. Yeah? And that's essentially how it works. You've got to line up all the cuts on the side by turning the discs at different angles depending on the bitting of the key, and then it opens. Let's have a look at a disc within the key then. So let's put the key in this way and turn it 90 degrees, so in and turn. So if I put that key in there like this and I turn it, watch the stop, 90 degrees, it goes quite a long way. Now let's go to a very deep cut, so turn it back and put it on a deep cut here. Now turn it, you'll see that the key can have quite a lot of movement, and then if I turn it, it only moves a small way. So long way, small way, and that's just because of the amount of metal removed from the key. Here is a sidebar. This sidebar is the thing which actually interacts with the cutaway here, and this is the trick to picking these things. So essentially what you're doing is you're applying tension so that the discs rub against the sidebar, and instead of a pin setting, you're feeling the sidebar click into place in this little notch here. And most of these locks don't have false gates. In other words, they don't have little cuts all the way along to obfuscate the interaction between the disc and the sidebar. And again, it's very hard to picture what that is. So I have another teaching tool over here, which is a clear plastic one. And what you can just about see, the top of the lock here is, can you see in there, right at the top, tip of the key, you can see the sidebar. It's currently in that position there, just there, like this. So it's, if I imagine I just pull this out of the lock, so it's in that position. You'll see that the discs are inside the lock, and you'll see that the sidebar is sat just above the discs by the core of the lock, and actually halfway out into the body of the lock, and that's what's trapping it. The body of the lock stopping the core from turning. But if you align all the gaps in the discs so that the sidebar can drop into it, then what you'll end up doing is providing a clear path, and it can turn. So I can show you that. Put the key in, turn it, if it's the right one. This is what happens when you have too many disc detaining keys around. There we go, it turns. So you can see what's happened. Again, you can see in there that the stops are all at different positions depending on the bitting of the key, and there is a sidebar. It has retracted in because all of the cuts have been rotated round on the discs to the right position, allowing the sidebar to slot in. If you notice, and you probably can see it, this cut here, you can't see where the sidebar sits because of refraction, but that cut there is where the sidebar would sit in between the body of the lock and the core, stopping the lock from turning. Okay, so hopefully that's a little bit of theory. Hopefully you can understand how it works. Essentially, to recap, you have a key, and it doesn't matter whether it's the Abloy or the basic Chinese one. The keys have angle cuts. The cuts interact with a particular disc. The disc rotates to a certain amount depending on how deep the cut is. Once the disc has rotated round to the right position, that'll allow a sidebar to drop into the cuts, which are all aligned, freeing up the core from the lock body and allowing the lock to turn. So, picking. How do we pick it? Well, different locks have different tools. So, whilst all of these can be picked with one tool, other locks like the Tib and the Abloy can't be picked with the same one. The Abloy Classic pick tool or the Abloy Profile pick tools are going to be several £100, depending on who makes it and where you get it from. The Tib tools are around £10 to £20. And the ones that pick most of the other ones made in China, like this, are around £4 or £5, about $5, somewhere around that, depending where you get it from. And this has been heavily modified. These usually come with quite thick tips, so I've filed this down to almost half, I think, and put a small groove in the tip here to allow for locks which have a small amount of warding in. But we'll come on to that in another video, maybe. So this tool essentially is a tension bit, and this tension's usually the first disc. Remember I said the first disc has a stop which interacts with the core of the lock providing tension, and a bit that slides in and out with a tip which can rotate each individual disc. Okay, so let's have a look at a lock. So what I'm going to do is put this in, and the first thing we do is we have to get a tension tool or something like that and set all of the pins to 0. It doesn't really matter what you use. I sometimes even use like a pick, so I've got a pick here. And it doesn't really matter. All you're doing is you're going to turn all of these, and I like to turn them all the way around, all the discs, all the way until they reach a top position. Then I like to turn them back. So there we go. They're all flat, and you can use I don't know, a tension tool, anything flat really that just turns them all so they're the right way around. Then I put in the disc detainer pick, and I apply a small amount of tension. Now, when I say small, I mean small, because these stops here, when you turn, and you can see I've got the first one, well, technically the second one, I'm turning it. Okay, so that's got some movement on it. That there. Now, if I put too much tension on, I'd have to put a lot of force on the pick tip to turn that disc if it was bound. So a couple of things happen. The tension can slip around this part of the tool, or the actual pick tip itself can actually turn round if it's got enough force, or snap, or weirdly, some of these other locks have a plastic core. They don't have a metal core like this, they have a plastic sheath around the discs, and you can actually end up over forcing the discs underneath. So when you put tension on, I find that you only need the smallest amount, genuinely, and that's the thing. I would say get one of these plastic ones and see what you're doing. And what you need to do is go along the pack and try one. If it's bound, then you turn it until you feel it drop into a notch. So I think that's dropped in. Go again. That one is bound, but I'll go along until I find one which feels more bound. Okay, that's definitely in slot. So then go along. This is binding, so turn it until it clicks. And I felt it go loose there. Next one. Oh, heavily bound, and a good click on that one. Okay, next one. That doesn't want to move, so I'll leave it. And the next one. All the way down to the last one. Hard to get sometimes. Oh. There, and that's bound. So the last disc is bound, second to last is bound, third is bound, fourth one from the last. Let's have a go. It seems to be stuck in that position, so that's good. This this one's stuck in that position too. Okay, so I'd say that the third disc here is quite heavily bound now. Get onto it. Not you. You. There we go. Ah, and we've got an open. I think we have. Just want to make sure that. There we go. Oh, it's a bit stiff, but it was because the second disc hadn't been picked. So there you go. All you're doing essentially is putting small amounts of tension on. I mean small, and you're going along each disc, seeing if it's bound. And by bound, I mean does it have resistance? Does it feel like it's resisting your picking? If it does, then what you can do is just turn it slowly the opposite direction. So I've turned all the discs this way, and you're turning them back. If it feels like it's not picked, so you're turning it, it feels like it's loose still, turn it back to the first position you were at, and then move on to the next one, turn it, the next one, turn it. Then you should get an open. And that's really all there is to it. I would say get a plastic lock. Get a plastic one, see what you're doing, get a feel for it first before you get some of these cheaper Chinese ones, because I have actually broken a number of these by putting too much tension on and forcing the stops on the discs into the plastic core. Just a word of warning. So get a plastic one, feel for that tension, feel for what you need to, feel for the clicks where the sidebar slips into the grooves of the discs themselves, and you should be pretty much okay. Then you'll be attacking all of these other ones, maybe not the Abloy until you've actually got a decent pick, but even I don't have one of those picks, and I've been picking for a couple of years now. Alright, hope you found that interesting. You should know pretty much all there is to know about Disc-Detained locks, including especially the Chinese ones, maybe not the more complex ones like the Abloy ProTech, but yeah, essentially these standard Disc-Detained locks just are full of discs. You need to rotate to the right position using a cheap pick tool. The other ones get a bit more complicated, but that's just life, isn't it? There's always something more complicated out there. Anyway, hope you found that interesting. Get out there and have a go with these locks, and I'll see you next time.